Started the recording part.
Okay, I'm starting to record.
Yep.
Basically, why do humans keep bees? We kind of all know that. I think our motivations are a little bit different than most people's, but most people keep them because, or kept them because they wanted an easy way to get honey. And do you understand why this thing is not? Oh, hello, cat. It's not moving.
Maybe your computer can't handle recording and
the thing at the same time.
Right. Try stop recording. Oh, wait.
So the Latin, I kind of looked at the etymology of the word apis for bee, and you see there that it goes back to potentially the Egyptian times. And I think it's kind of interesting because in Spanish, the word for bee is abeja. So that also has some relationship to the Egyptian word for honeybee and also the Latin word for honeybee. So when did it start? The humans have probably been collecting honey for as long as they've existed. Back in the day before sugar became an item, honey really was the only natural way for people to sweeten their food. And what you see on the screen is one of the earliest depictions of beekeeping. It's 8,000 years old, and it was found in a cave near Valencia in Spain. And you can see that there's somebody up on the side of who knows what, a cliff or tree, with their arms stuck into the hive and what I assume are bees buzzing around. So there's evidence that the Egyptians also kept bees, that they actually tried to domesticate bees to the extent that bees can be domesticated. There's evidence that they use smoke to calm bees, and as you can see in the picture on the screen, they actually were keeping bees in probably terracotta pipes. So there's also evidence of beekeeping during Egyptian times from the Egyptian tombs. You can see over in the pictures that there's a hieroglyphic of a guy with bees. There's also a picture of a guy pouring honey into a container with bees flying around. And as you can see from my writing, that in Tutankhamun's tomb, there were containers that were labeled as containing honey, although there wasn't any honey found in the jars. Who knows what happened to it? I mean, I guess some grave robbers could have taken it, or some animals could have eaten it out, because there have been jars of buried honey that have been buried for many, many years, and there's still honey in them, and the honey is still edible. Beeswax and honey was also used in mummification during Egyptian times. Moving on to the ancient Greeks, there is pictorial evidence of bees. Mother Earth, the Mother Earth goddess Artemis, was depicted as half bee, half woman. And there is writing by Aristotle that he was observing bees in his History of Animals. So he identified in that written text 3 types of bees: the queen, the drone, and the worker bee, and he observed bee development in the comb. There's also evidence that Alexander the Great was embalmed with honey and wax. Interestingly, there's no pictorial evidence from the Romans of beekeeping, but there is evidence that they did keep bees and that they copied their beekeeping methods from the Egyptians and the Greeks. And I don't know if anyone had the opportunity to go to the Pompeii exhibit, but I thought it was really interesting that the Romans were very practically oriented and not very oriented toward decoration and art, even though there is that in their in their objects, but their objects are tend to be much more practical than decorative.
Mm.
So there are writings that show that the Romans were beekeeping. It says here that Virgil, among other Roman writers, talked about bees, and they found Roman writings that include recipes for sugar syrup for feeding the bees. Now, I don't know how that's possible because sugar really didn't show up until later on, but they must have been making something that cut down on honey, added water to honey. In 60 AD, Comella, a Roman, described beekeeping tools, including a smoker, a hive tool, and there's evidence that these were very much like those that are used today. So in the New World, people were keeping bees as well. When the Spanish landed, they found that the Mayans were keeping bees, and the Spanish were very surprised. And when Kevin and I were in Panama, we had the opportunity to see some of the bees that might have been kept by the Mayans. There were some very small bees that were about ant size, and people would keep the bees in their homes because they were all stingless, and they could harvest small amounts of honey at any given time. So they might harvest a couple of tablespoons of honey for their personal use, let the bees build it up again, and then harvest it. The Mayans used honey medicinally, and the Mayans also had several gods that were bees. Bees were also, there's also evidence of bees in ancient China. So as you can see on the screen, I put that the earliest written recording of bees, which were called fang, were found on animal bones that dated from 3000 BCE. And the first recorded professional beekeeper, Jiang Qi, supposedly trained other beekeepers to keep bees. And the Chinese would have been keeping Apis cerana, which we have heard a little bit about in terms of the varroa mite. And according to evidence, Apis mellifera, the European honeybee, was introduced in 1911. There is evidence that Russians took, and this is much later, but Russians took Apis mellifera into China or to the eastern side of Russia, which is where they picked up the varroa mite. And then the beehives were taken back toward Europe, and that lovely saga began. So moving on to beekeeping in medieval Europe, the beekeepers were keeping bees in skeps, which we know are woven from straw or hay, and are currently illegal in the United States because they're not considered to be sanitary. Beekeeping was mentioned in a book about the Norman conquest. The evidence is that the Germans were the ones that first made skeps. And for medieval Europeans, beeswax was as important as honey because the church needed a lot of it for candles. Kevin and I were watching the show Victoria, and there was one show where they were trying to cut back on costs in the palace, and so they changed from beeswax candles to candles made from tallow, and they were complaining because the tallow candles smelled bad and burnt more quickly. So beeswax for candles was really important. Like I said, until probably late medieval times, sugar wasn't available, and so most of the alcoholic drinks that people drank in Europe were made from honey. And there were a variety of different kinds. You can see here that hydromel was a favorite of Elizabeth I. So in the late Middle Ages, Marco Polo returns from Asia, and he has with him sugarcane, which starts to get planted, probably mostly in the warmer parts of the Middle East and things like that. But sugarcane is much cheaper as a source of sweetener than honey. And so sugar starts to displace honey as the sweetener that people use in their foods. Mead held on for a while. It was considered to be something that the higher class people, the people who had more money, could drink. And so lower class people would be drinking things made with sugar. And here is a picture of a book that talks about honey as medicine from around 1480. So beekeeping during the European Renaissance, this is when people started to really look at bees scientifically. I mean, there might have been beforehand, but I think during the Middle Ages, people were worried about a lot of other things. So like getting enough food to eat. And so, I'm sorry about that.
You lose you?
Sorry. So, I don't know why it moved on. Anyways, during the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance, people were starting to look at the bees scientifically. Then in the early 1600s, bees started to be moved from Europe to America. They were brought to Virginia in 1622, or at least they attempted to bring bees to America in 1622. It was very difficult at first for the settlers to bring bees across the North Atlantic. The bees ended up in Massachusetts in 1638, and Native Americans, as we know, Apis mellifera wasn't native to North America, and the Native Americans called the bees the white man's flies. Beeswax was a recorded export in Virginia in the 1700s, and by the 1800s, honeybees were feral throughout North America, at least on the eastern seaboard. Bees were taken to the West Coast in the mid 1800s. The Mormons took bees to Utah in the 1840s, and the Mormons the symbol of the Mormons is the beehive. And they took bees on ships around Cape Horn to California.
That must have went well.
Sorry guys, my computer is freezing. Oh. So there's some evidence that the bees were patriots. I found this picture of the soldiers using bees in warfare. And I think I've read some other things in Thomas Seeley's book about the history of beekeeping and the fact that bees were used in warfare. They were either taken in skeps and thrown with kind of catapulting into the middle of the other troops, or there's actually even evidence that hives were poisoned and the soldiers would eat the poison honey and either get very sick or die. So one of the more famous scientists in relation to bees is Carl von Frisch. He studied bees for 50 years and he focused on bee perception, and he's the one that identified the waggle dance, for which he won the 1973 Nobel Prize.
It was 1873? Goodness gracious.
And here's a picture of Frisch's dancing bees. So I thought that this lady was kind of interesting as well. She was trained as a quantum mathematician, Eva Crane, and she became a beekeeper when she and her husband got a hive as a wedding present during World War II. She wrote many articles, books, and papers about bees, and two of her important books on beekeeping, Bees and Beekeeping, and the World History of Beekeeping and Honey Hunting were written in the 1990s while she was in her 70s and 80s.
Good girl.
So tools of the trade. Artificial hives have been something men and women have been using for many, many years for obvious reasons. They wanted to be able to control where the bees were and the ability to harvest the bees and the bee products. So they began keeping bees in artificial hives before even history was written down. And they used hollow logs, pottery hives. We saw some evidence of that in the Egyptian times, wooden boxes, and skeps. And here's a picture of a whole bunch of different kinds of beehives, natural beehives from the Museum of Honey in France. Well, maybe not so natural either, because down there in the lower left-hand corner are some some boxes.
Yeah. Pretty cool.
Beekeepers did have top bar hives. So here is a picture of a Greek hive that was used in the 1600s. And you can see that they have the pieces of wood on the top with the idea that the bees would be building comb down into the skep. I don't know if it had a lid or not. I can't imagine that the bees would use it if it wasn't covered in dark. The first hive patent was granted around 1657 to John Getty by Charles II of England. And here's a picture of it from the top, and it had removable inner frames. I do not know why he decided to use an octagon shape. That seems kind of interesting, but there you go.
Looks good.
The leaf hive was invented by Francis Huber in 1789, and it was the first known hive with movable parts. Huber was blind. He went blind when he was 15, and he still was very fascinated by bees, and so he used his servant and other assistants to help him make observations about the bees. And so many of his observations, although probably done by other people as well, were written down. And so he's credited with showing that bees laid eggs, bees mated in flight, and some of the other things about bees. And here's a couple of other examples of pre-Langstroth hives. So the beekeepers were trying to segregate the brood from the honey so that they wouldn't destroy the brood. And I don't know how successful they were with these contraptions. But according to this, they got 10 to 15 pounds of honey a year. And if that's the case, they're probably closer to what Thomas Seeley is suggesting we do, which is keep our bees in one hive body and not two. So the Langstroth hive was made by Lorenzo Langstroth, and I like to imagine him wandering around with his depression, thinking about bees, and coming up with the idea of having a Langstroth hive. And so you see an illustration of him here with boxes with removable frames. And he was the one that coined the term bee space. So he was the one that decided that, or observed that the bees would fill anything that was greater than 3/8 of an inch with wax, comb, and anything that was less than that, they would use propolis on. And so the addition of the Hoffman frame completed the evolution of the modern beehive. Whoops. Oh, it's working better. So smokers. Although the Egyptians did use smoke to calm their bees, Moses Quimby was credited with inventing the first bellows smoker around 1857. And you see a picture of it on the right-hand side of the screen. These guys look the same. So it was improved upon by T.F. Bingham in the 1880s. His bellows was, or his smoker was essentially the same as Quimby's, except he added the wooden faces to the bellows, which probably made it easier to use. And there's actually a guy who was interested in the history of bee smokers. And so you can look on YouTube for the history of bee smokers. Veils, it looks to me like veils didn't change much between the Middle Ages and current times. I mean, basically, we are just trying to keep our faces safe from bee stings. In the Middle Ages, they obviously wouldn't, they wouldn't have had net, I don't think. So I'm not exactly sure how their veils worked, if they had holes poked in the cloth or exactly how that worked, but it would have been interesting to see. This is a 1945 photo of John McFadden with an automatic honeycomb decapper. I'm not sure if he was the inventor or if this is just a picture that I found.
That's some toys.
So just like now, there's different ways to extract. The Egyptians collected comb in a cow skin and crushed it by stepping on the skin. And we kind of do that, except that we use cheesecloth. I don't have a lot of cow skin laying around. One of the problems with that kind of extraction is that the bees were killed to get the honey. There were wax presses. Like I said, the wax was really an important thing that they wanted from the bees. And I have here that Austrian Major Francesco di Hrushka invented the first centrifugal honey extractor in 1865. So supposedly the idea came to him as he watched his son swing a bucket of honey around, a way to separate the honey from the frames. A.I. Root of Ohio
That's just a dog. Oh.
is credited with building an extractor for the Langstroth hive frames. And he wrote the ABC and XYZ of bee culture and started Bee Culture magazine. And I don't know if he is behind Dedant or, but I'm thinking that's he was the founder of Dedant. And so that's basically the end of my presentation, and I have some of my sources here. And thank you, and I'm gonna stop recording. Any questions?